So, something to tell you about me. I don't like public speaking, and I'm not quite sure how Mr. Dixon actually got me to agree to this. And it's funny too, for those people that know me, I'm very boisterous, I say what I think, but yeah, I don't like public speaking. So if I shake a lot, it's not the coffee, it's just my nerves, and I will try to stay focused. And again, I'm trying to focus not on you, but the back wall. So,
Robbin,
yeah.
Speak up, we cannot hear you.
Yes, sir. And usually that's not a problem for me, but I'm nervous.
Preach it, sister.
Yeah, so just raise your hand if I'm not projecting well. Okay, so this was a really interesting topic for me. Although I have on many occasions done a very basic in-service on identifying exploitation, abuse, and neglect, in this subgroup, we're also going to talk about how to prevent your businesses from accusations of abuse, exploitation, and neglect, right? So that's a little different than what our typical process is for this kind of in-service. What was also interesting was when I was looking at the different type of businesses, I mean, you could almost really just have an in-service based on the business model. So I tried to make it very generic. However, in each industry, because of the purpose, because of what information you can access and what information you cannot, it really is very different. Also, I'm very lucky that a lot of what I'm going to discuss goes back to morals and ethics, where the legal implications will be addressed later by Mr. Dixon. But hopefully at some point, him and I will also schedule an intensive where we're able to get into more details with you based on the type of business you're running. Because like I said, some of the things I'm going to say, you're not going to have access to if you're in sales in the car industry versus a healthcare industry. So bear with me on my being generic. I've been in this area doing social services for the last 20 years. I guess I've been doing it total about 25. I worked in a nursing home for 8 years as a director. I worked as an executive director in a 60-bed secured assisted living facility for 12 years, one of my all-time favorite jobs. I worked at One Senior Place for almost 3 years, supervising their home care company and their care management company. And I've been working for myself in my company, which is Aging Life Care Partners, for the last 2.5 years. All right, so again, this kind of, again, I want to go into, and there are certain legal definitions, although I've tried to condense them as we go through this process, because again, the legal process and terminology and implications will be addressed far better by Mr. Dixon in his section, which you're number 5, 6? 4, you're number 4. So if you have questions regarding the implications of the things that I'm saying, you might just want to take note, write it down, and address it with legal, because that's probably better. So business interactions with vulnerable adults. And again, I had to remember we're not all in healthcare, right? So what is a vulnerable adult? And he'll get more into that. My focus is going to be that ethical process of understanding how abuse, exploitation, neglect interfaces with our day-to-day business dealings, understanding that many situations fall into a gray area. It's really nice when it's black and white, but I'm going to tell you 99% of the issues, the concerns, the problems that we have really fall into a very gray area. So a lot of my examples as we go through, I'm going to write like an example of black, of white, and then a lot of gray. Yeah, a lot of gray. I also wanted to just acknowledge that when I use the term caregiver, I don't mean necessarily a professional caregiver. I mean anybody in the role of caregiver, whether that's a neighbor, a family member, a professional caregiver, and again, even a lot of our businesses technically fall into that definition. And again, Scott will go more into that. Next, please. So abuse, neglect, and exploitation are complex and often hidden problems. The Department of Children and Families, which we love to call DCF, makes it much easier, investigates and corrects abuse, neglect, and exploitation through reports taken by the Florida Abuse Hotline, which again, I think most of us in the healthcare field have that number memorized. We also have it posted in 27 different places of our business. We do in-services and education on it constantly. These reports can be initiated anonymously. Now that's really important, I have found, when working with people, because there's a certain level of guilt which I don't necessarily fully understand, when we call in on the hotline number. Well, what if they're not being abused? Well, again, the definition and the point of reporting is suspected. So they're not saying you have to know it's occurring. But again, I've always been a firm believer, I would rather report and be wrong than not report and something happen that I could have prevented. So I'm a big advocate. I'm also someone who calls the abuse hotline, which, if I understand correctly, is answered in Tallahassee, mostly by FSU students, and often have to request a manager because the person I'm speaking with isn't necessarily understanding my concerns. So sometimes, even when you call it in, if you really know you should be calling it in, you really got to ask for that supervisor, has been my experience, especially with exploitation. So again, I just want to reiterate, and Scott will reiterate more later, it is suspected abuse. So often I interface with individuals and they're like, well, I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure. Well, call it in. Call it in. When I have worked in nursing homes in ALFs on occasion, when I had angry family members, which does occur, and they would make an accusation at my staff, like, oh, well, I think they did that on purpose. I would call the abuse hotline on myself. Now, again, often it wasn't taken, but I did my due diligence. If someone's going to accuse me of something, I'm going to self-report because I have nothing to hide. Indicators of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Again, so many of the physical indicators that are listed and true, I also looked at the DCF in-service information. It's all black and white, right? So it's unexplained fractures, inappropriate clothing, unkept presentation, sexual abuse, disheveled, dirty, lacerations, burns, scars, bruises, lumps, lice, fleas. But that's obvious, right? That's black and white. It's not that gray area. Environmental indicators, too little clothing for weather. Hazards, living, lack of repairs, large number of animals, poor care, spoiled food on the counter, lack of support, garbage thrown around, limited foods, socially isolated, opened foods, expired foods. Again, I think when we're interfacing with these potential clients, especially from like the perspective of businesses, maybe you're there to repair a roof, right? And we all hear people have the right to make poor choices, right? So if I decide that I want to be a personal hoarder, I have the right to live that way, right? Because why? Because I'm competent and I'm capable and I'm not considered a vulnerable adult, so I can make bad choices. When there are vulnerable adults that may have impairments, that can be a sign of all kinds of other health issues, both mental health and physical health issues. And maybe they don't want to be a hoarder. Maybe it's literally they can't get the garbage out to the front of the house. Or maybe they can't remember what day the garbage is supposed to be out front of the house. Next, please. Financial indicators. Again, this one's hard for a lot of the different companies because you don't always have access to that financial information. I would say healthcare probably has more interaction in that process. But again, unusual bank activity, which I think we see that a lot as social workers in home health care and different kinds of healthcare systems. Advanced directive changes. I'm in a case right now, it's very interesting. 11 siblings, mom's impaired, she had a power of attorney, so they didn't need to do guardianship, thank goodness for advanced directives, and then all the advanced directives got changed. And mom doesn't know what year it is. So when you go into contractual agreements, you really should at least know the year and the concept of the contract. Again, I believe Scott will go into that in more detail regarding that part of it, but it is really scary out there. They have little or no money, which again happens. Retirement's not easy. But sometimes you'll know that their income is high. Why? Because they'll talk about where they worked. Maybe they were a retired Harris employee and they were in the military. So you're sitting there thinking to yourself, they're eating cat food and ramen noodles, but again, he's a 3-star colonel. He's probably got a couple thousand coming in there. He's probably got a couple thousand from Harris. It just doesn't make sense, right? The money coming in, where's the money going out? Now again, in a perfect world, maybe they just don't know how to execute the money going out. Or, in many cases, other people are taking the money. And again, as scary as it is, often that is family members. Everybody thinks that the number one person that, they always jump straight to the caregivers, especially professional caregivers. And it's so interesting to me because 90% of the exploitation cases that I see are family members. And they are righteous and indignant in their process of taking that money. They deserve it. It's theirs. It's their inheritance, which I love that. I love that because I'm always like, but they're not dead yet. It's a very, well, it's true, right? Somebody's got to say it. I have family members that call themselves the beneficiaries. Not children, they call themselves the beneficiaries. And I'm the first to be like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but your mom's still alive. Technically, it's her money. But it's also why a lot of people don't like me, but it's okay. Yeah, okay, good. Next slide. Behavior of the perpetrator. Now again, people often assume that the perpetrator is not a family member. But again, like I said, you really do have to keep that in mind. Sometimes it is the power of attorney. Sometimes it is the neighbor. Again, this is when it's obvious. This is when it's easy. There's a lot of family discord. Maybe the daughter that you're interfacing with who lives in the house also or has come to purchase something from your company is there, showing very little concern or respect for the vulnerable adult. Often they have poor self-control. Name calling, that's again very black and white. History of drug and alcohol abuse, striking, scapegoating, manipulative, shoving, hostile, poor insight, beating, secretive, blaming. Those are all very obvious indicators, and I'm going to tell you too, those are not usually things that people do in front of other people. Because if they are, then they're really insane. Like, take it up a notch, because most perpetrators want to be presented as a good person. To be honest, they're often the martyr. They're the one who is sharing too much information, letting you know how great they are, all the wonderful things they've done for mom and dad. They have a list. They let you know every moment that they have spent in their life and never wanting remuneration. Until you start looking through the bank records and you realize, oh, well, your mom bought you that $150,000 car and they bought you the house. Oh yeah, but I deserved that. That was understandable. I worked hard. Again, I think so often we don't look at who we're supposed to be looking at. And I think a lot of the problem with that is, and I've taken a lot of this information from the DCF website, is because we always look in terms of black and white, right? Obviously, if you saw somebody strike another person, you would call the police. You would call the abuse hotline. But I promise you, life is not that easy. It's not that simple. Next slide, please. So I like to get into the less, in the gray, right? What does the perpetrator really look like? Because I'm going to tell you 99% of the time it's not going to look like the slide before this. So it's the martyr. They're seeking validation. They want you to tell them how great they are. They want you to know exactly how many hours per week they put into that client, what they've been doing, how much time. There's no signs of guilt, right? Because you would think, well, they feel guilty. Well, no, they don't. They don't feel guilty because they feel righteous. They feel that they have made a commitment, that they have put in the time, and they deserve it. It is their money. I've even seen it where when the client was competent and not vulnerable, maybe they gave out a lot of money to different kids. So now the child taking the money still feels validated. Well, she bought cars for my sister. She paid for college for my sister. So this $50,000 that I've taken, it's fair. When you have a conversation, like literally you step back a little bit like, wow, talk about deep-seated childhood issues. Because everything comes out. Again, that's that righteous manipulation. Pushing an agenda. Again, what is pushing an agenda? It's creating that undue influence. So maybe you are in a sales position. Maybe you can see that daughter pushing that client and they don't want to do it. And you can see that process. And again, it's not blatant. It's not well, Mom, you've got to pay for my roof, or I'm going to hit you. It's more like, well, I guess me and the grandkids will just suffer. I mean, I guess if you needed someplace to stay, you wouldn't be able to stay there with a roof that doesn't work well. You know, it's that kind of manipulation, which again, my kids manipulate me every day, right? Every day. I am manipulated by a 22-year-old child and a 15-year-old who thinks she's an adult. And I'm going to be honest, they're really good at it. I mean, I can say no 100 times. The next thing I know, I'm buying a puppy. I have 4 cats that I don't want. I am manipulated every day. But again, I am competent. I am capable. I do understand the implications of my poor choices. 4 cats, poor choice. But a vulnerable adult doesn't. You know, they don't fully understand what the implications are. What they know is that person is in a position of power to them. They have control over them, right? How are they going to get to their doctor's appointments if their daughter's mad at them? How are they going to get food in the house if that caregiver is the only person giving them some support? And again, we kind of get into undue influence, but often the perpetrator does have what I call it white knight syndrome. Everybody know what that is, right? Like, I'm going to come in, I'm going to fix everything because I'm amazing and I'm great and I don't want anything for it. But yeah, she wanted to buy me a car. So, you know, I let her because I'm a good guy, right? Next one, please. You know, undue influence to me, and again, there are legal definitions of the term undue influence, and again, I'm going to defer that to Scott. But I think that when we talk about you observing abuse, neglect, and exploitation, you have to understand that there is this concept of undue influence when there's a vulnerable adult involved. And again, I think mattering on where you work, that can look very different. For example, in private duty, you will often see family members create undue influence to reduce cost. Not to spend more, to reduce cost, right? So they come in and they're like, Mom, you don't need 12 hours a day. 4 hours a day is fine. You know I'll be there for you. Now I might have 5 kids and work, 2 jobs, so no, I'm probably not going to be there for them. So why do they want to reduce the expense? Because it's their inheritance and they don't want it spent. With business industry, you may see it more as purchasing items that are not going to be used by the client, right? So you've got an 85-year-old who wants a Porsche, but the daughter really wants the Porsche. And it's going to be the daughter driving the Porsche. Now again, if I'm dumb enough and my 15-year-old manipulates me well and somebody's dumb enough to give me that loan and I get her a Porsche, that's okay. But if I am vulnerable and I'm being manipulated and I don't understand the concepts of what I'm doing, then no, that shouldn't happen. And that's an ethical process, right? So, undue influence, the amount of pressure which one uses to force someone to execute a will, give a gift, sign a contract. Key element is that the influence was so great that the customer, party to the contract, had lost the ability to exercise his or her own judgment and could not refuse to give in to the pressure. Evidence of such dominance of another's mind may result in invalidation of the will, gift, contract by court if the will, gift, or contract is challenged. Now again, undue influence is hard to prove. It's hard to prove. And again, undue influence on competent people, totally okay. But when you're selling or you're in a business industry where you can see that the expenses really aren't benefiting that person and they aren't able to fully understand the contract, is when things get really gray. Because again, we're not just talking about abuse and you noticing it, we're talking about you being able to defend yourself from other people accusing you of abuse, right? So capacity. People can have the capacity to make bad decisions. Goodness knows, I do it a lot. But if they lack that capacity, and again, we're not in a position to judge the capacity, but we are in a position to say, hey, there's a lot of red flags here. I think I'm going to call somebody. I'm going to intervene in this process. Now again, that may be you saying something, or it may be you calling somebody else. Maybe you calling the 1-800-ABUSE hotline. Maybe it's calling Mr. Dixon or one of the other care managers to see if they'll do a well visit. Maybe it's getting hold of the power of attorney, which again, in healthcare, that's one of the questions we tend to ask. Who's your power of attorney? May we have a copy of the, the document? So yeah, it is easier for us to be able to reach out to that second level. But I mean, I think in businesses, you should be able to have an emergency contact, right? I mean, what if you are repairing the roof and you go into the house and the person's on the floor, right? I mean, I think it's okay to ask for an emergency contact in any business industry in case there's an issue. You have to be able to protect yourself and your company. And again, I mean, I have over the years worked for companies that don't necessarily want to protect me. And that's really hard too. It's very hard. But at the end of the day, when we go back to the ethics and morals of things, like I know every decision I make I can live with. There's very few things that I regret that I made a decision on. I regret losing some money on those decisions, but I knew at that moment I made the decision for the right reasons, even if they weren't great options. You've got to be able to do that, and you've got to be able to work for a company that supports that process and understands it.
You have like 2 minutes, okay?
Well, you took a lot of my time, Mr. Dixon.
4 minutes. 4 minutes.
Okay. Neglect, the failure or omission to provide care, supervision, services necessary to maintain physical and mental health, failure to protect, carelessness, which produces or can reasonably be expected to result in serious physical or psychological injury. Black and white, right, the easy stuff. You go to the house, there's no running water, there's no electricity, and all they're worried about is that you wash their car, but there's no water. Minimal access to food or medical care. These are easy. It's that gray area. The customer presents disheveled, unclean, and uncared for, black and white. The customer presents with some memory loss. Caregiver is not present at the home and is at work, leaving customer alone for extended amounts of time. And again, I think as businesses, we see that a lot. And again, it gets gray, right? Like, who are we to judge? We're not in that house. But why not make sure it's safe? Why not make sure it's safe? And there's a lot of different ways to do that. One, by referring out to somebody to do a home visit. Another, again, is to call the 1-800 number. Let them come out, make an assessment whether that person is safe at home. Next slide. Abuse, any willful act or threatened act which causes or is likely to cause impairments to the physical, mental, or emotional health of the customer, including omissions. Black and white. You overhear the customer being threatened by the person caring for them. Again, that's easy. You observe customer being pushed around, smacked, physically restrained. Easy. You know what to do. You observe the customer with multi-layer bruising of different colors and age that seem consistent with injuries caused by another, but you see absolutely no signs that somebody's abusing them, right? You've got the martyr in the house telling you what a great job she's doing. She's super nice to the client in front of you. She is just super nice, but it just doesn't look right, right? It doesn't pass the sniff test. Call. Nobody has to know who you are. Again, it is better to call and know that it's been investigated. And again, a lot of times calling them, even if they don't find that abuse was done or there wasn't enough proof, at least gets them started in a process, right? A lot of times DCF does a lot of social work in their process, hooking them up with different connections, getting the power of attorney involved. Maybe the power of attorney wasn't aware of how bad it was. Next, please. This one's really hard. Knowingly by deception or intimidation, obtaining or using or attempting to obtain the customer's funds, assets, or property with intent to deprive the customer of such assets. Again, isn't that sales? I mean, I know that sounds terrible, but right? I mean, not the deception, but the intimidation part, right? Like, are you ready to do that today? If we get to an agreed upon number, we're doing it today, right? There is a certain amount of sales process that supports intimidation. But again, you can talk me into buying the Porsche, but if the person doesn't even know which car they bought, that's a sign that maybe you shouldn't have sold it to him. He's standing up. He's starting to stress me out. Okay, the customer has no money but receives large monthly retirement checks. Again, but where's the money? And again, some of you guys would never know that. Some of us wonder, right? Next slide, quick, quick. That's it? Okay, moving forward. Protect yourself, the customer, and company you represent. Isn't there one more? No? Yes, I'm going to do it real fast. If you suspect abuse, neglect, or exploitation, you must report it 1-800-96-ABUSE. If you're observing the customer making poor choices or being in an unsafe situation, you need to intervene. That may mean contacting DCF. Again, you can do it anonymously, so don't allow yourself to get stuck in that place where you don't feel like you should call because you don't want to be involved. You don't have to be involved, but you should still call. A care manager to see if they can make a social visit, a family member to help get them involved. If you are concerned regarding a customer's ability to understand your contractual agreement, you should create safeguards to support your choice to work with them or not. This may involve having a witness to discussions, outlining options in writing when you normally would not, giving your customer resources, making sure that the options are laid out in writing so that you can defend your decision, and that, I didn't get that part. But above all, when dealing with vulnerable adult and establishing a contractual agreement, make sure that you're doing right by the person, right? So if you're doing right by the person, that's protecting you and it is protecting the company. Ensure your process, your fees, your work is defendable. Market price. Document what attempts you made to intervene. Every situation is different, as is the way each of your companies work with that customer, but if you are doing the right thing, treating them as your own parent and grandparent, assuming you like them, your parent and grandparent, utilizing an ethical and moral approach to that process, you and the customer and your company will be better off. So if you're working with a 92-year-old customer who's willing to pay $45,000 for a $23,000 car, and you're concerned regarding their understanding of the cost and the contract, maybe you should actually sell it to them for the $23,000. Or maybe $24,000, make $1,000 on it, but let's not make $20,000 on it. Consider charging them what the car is worth. Next slide. Again, that's just kind of an overview, so I'm just going to keep going because I know I've overextended this process and Rob's getting antsy. And I didn't really want to talk anyway, so I'm actually impressed that I've done so well.
All right, so a couple questions. So who in here, these might be on your test, by the way.
Sheriff's here.
Who in here is a mandatory reporter? Everybody's a mandatory reporter. And also, it's better to be safe than sorry, right?
Every day.
So Julio, say hi, sir.
Hi, Julio.
So if Julio has a senior at risk, could he might call you to ask questions to
He
maybe?
could call me. He could call you. He could call lots of
Robbin?
people in
You
here.
call
Robbin
Lisa?
Feemeister, Lisa.
Okay, all right. So guys, we're all here for you. So when you have questions, you can always call, okay? Mike is with SunTrust Bank. Mike, you can call Robbin and ask, okay? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Troy?